So Ben, I've been excited for this show because since the exercise mechanics world has sort of taken over the industry, there are varying levels of application and people that apply it incredibly poorly and people apply it incredibly well but tend to overly science it. I find your stuff perfectly in the middle where everything is actionable. So before we get on to our first question, if people don't know who the modern meathead is, tell us a little bit about Ben.
Yeah. So first of all, I really appreciate that because that's kind of what I have set out to do. That's like kind of the gap that I envision filling. And that's kind of where the concept of the modern meathead came from, right? Is because I saw, a lot of people who were these sort of sciencey nerds who loved the theory, who didn't quite know how to transfer that theory into application. And then you see the meatheads on the other side of the coin who are just there's no such thing as science. It's all gym bro stuff. It's all train hard, sweat, take the stuff and train with your bros. So I think that there's a reasonable middle ground to be found. And that's kind of where the concept of the modern meathead came from. It's just like, hey, the meatheads who read, meatheads who like to learn and apply that stuff to the actual, practical setting, but who don't sort of lose the forest for a single tree. And so, I myself come from a background in sports and powerlifting, like a lot of people who sort of are failed athletes who transition into trying to lift weights. And then they discover that like powerlifting is actually kind of hard to get good at. And it also sucks for your joints. And then you move past that and you move more into the bodybuilding realm. But the modern meathead concept was sort of built off of all of my, we'll say issues as a lifter, all the injuries, all the discomforts, all the frustrations, kind of like that typical story of, you have this failure over here. So you learn to solve problems that sort of contribute to the failure. And then you sort of help other people and you see people in your, you see yourself and other people and younger versions of you and other people. And so that's kind of who I'm speaking to, or at least who I'm trying to speak to now with just all these sort of nuances that I'm trying to translate into real people terms. So I think that's kind of a good sort of Cliff Notes version of where I'm currently at. And, I work with trainers as well. So hopefully I do have the capacity to get a little bit more nuance when it's appropriate. But for social media, I do find that, like you and I were talking about prior to the call here, a lot of the nuance sort of gets mixed up with the stuff that actually matters. But that doesn't mean that the nuance can't contribute to the stuff that actually matters, if that makes sense.
Makes total sense. And I completely agree with this because you often find this almost tribal disconnect between the people who have gone down sort of the RTS mechanics route. And, some of them are get away with it by being very accomplished bodybuilders like Ben Pekulski, but other people who may be on the slightly smaller side here, you got the bodybuilders go, oh, just lift heavy. And you get people that are trying to optimize in massive inverted commas, everything that you never lift any heavy weight. And then you got the bodybuilders on the other side who, yeah, their elbows don't hurt now, but in 10 years, it might be a different story. And I think that middle ground's important because one, as you said, we want to make sure the stuff that matters, progressive overload, getting stronger, lifting hard, going near failure, is still important here. And if we can find ways to do it better, and that's what I think your content does very well, is like, look, here's how to make something that is, yes, a mechanics thing, very accessible for the bodybuilder that just likes to train. You're giving them a bit of what they want, with a bit of what they need sprinkled in there. So like going into, you mentioned obviously your injuries and things like this is where you get into it. What made you go into the world of the mechanics route other than like, because some people go down the Postural Restoration Institute, what I call sort of like movement mechanics and breath work and things like this. And other people go down the very much what I call muscle mechanics, which is resistance profiles, moment arms. Like, how did this journey start for you and how have you ended up where you're at?
Yeah, that's exactly it. Actually, is as a consequence of injury, discomfort, all that stuff. I definitely started in the rehab realm. So you mentioned PRI. There are other systems that are sort of tangential to PRI that aren't it itself, but are sort of like these pseudo versions of it that are described as other things. And so I very much started out sort of on the breathing realm of things. I've been looking into anatomy based stuff for a lot longer than that, but really is sort of in the middle of college was when I really started to dive deep into specific systems. So that was, however many years ago now. But, where I'm currently at is much more, as I'm sure you sure you've recognized in the mechanics realm, in the muscle mechanics realm, and the physics realm. And that's where I sort of moved to over time. So I would say I was kind of heavily invested in the rehab stuff for a good year and a half, 2 years before I really started to dive a lot more deeply into the physics stuff. And you mentioned RTS, and Tom Purvis is someone who has been a mentor to me, both through the online space and in person. I've seen him in Oklahoma, and he's just someone who is sort of the godfather of this stuff and has really pioneered a lot of the industry. And what's funny about it too, to me, is a lot of people know terms like strength profile and resistance profile, and they don't know Tom, which is like it's kind of like I don't maybe know what a good analogy here is. But it's like the person who made the thing is somehow not really recognized because he has no interest in being recognized, which is kind of, it's admirable in some ways, but it's kind of funny to me. And
it's
so,
the biggest strength and the biggest weakness of RTS as well, in a way, because
I think so too.
Great that the message is now bigger than Tom himself. You find the things get watered down the more you move away from people who have learned exercise mechanics or RTS principles secondhand or third hand or fourth hand rather than it directly from source.
Yeah. And I understand why Tom has such a disdain for social media. He almost talks about it more than he talks about, resistance profiles at this point. But, it's because they've kind of, social media as a whole has kind of like taken his baby and just like thrown it all over the place, But that's just kind of I don't really think there is a point in sort of spending too much time thinking about that and getting angry about that, but rather just to try to distill the information in a way where you're getting, for the average person, you're getting 80 to 90% of what you need on the surface, and you're not, because like I was talking about this with someone yesterday. People generally, like normal people who are not like listening to podcasts like these, they're not interested in like, oh, why does this feel this way when I do this? They're just like, give me the thing. Just tell me what to do with the thing. I don't want to think too much about it. And that's totally respectable. And I'm like that in pretty much every other area of my life. I'm like, give me the cliff notes and tell me what I want to know. So that's kind of when I made a transition content wise from trying to be more nuanced, trying to speak at a little bit of a higher level to just like, let me just water this down to the essential components to the average person. And like, lo and behold, a lot of the people who are into the nuances still appreciate that, because a lot of times it's something that they maybe haven't thought about, or maybe they're not seeing it a specific way. But anyway, I don't want to digress too much. When I dove into the physics stuff more deeply was, I think, when I really started to be able to think a lot more in terms of first principles rather than in individual sorts of bits of information. And I think this is a really important topic, generally speaking, that I don't hear talked about enough, which is social media. Everything I kind of view as a trade-off. So social media is this trade-off, and it's this big trade-off between you get a lot of information very quickly, but you don't get a lot of the nuance and a lot of the context that you might in a real learning setting. And the trade-off of a real learning setting, let's say like taking a 9-day seminar with Tom, is like you get a lot of nuance and you really dive into the nitty-gritty, but you yourself have to do the work. You yourself have to actually be able to draw from that what is valuable to you. And you have to decide, okay, are these things I'm going to use and how am I going to use them? And so, I think real learning occurs at the principle-based level. And there's nothing really that is principle-based directly that gets put on social media, because you can't, no one wants to watch a 60-second clip of like you drawing a moment arm, in a direction of resistance of friction and how that creates, a specific line of force that's distinct from what you see. No one wants to like see that shit. They just want to know like, hey, is this a quad thing? Is this a glute thing? Is this an adductor thing? So everything just kind of being a trade-off. I don't necessarily see one thing as better than the other. And so I think just finding that middle ground constantly and just presenting information as information and not really telling people what to think has sort of where I've moved to over time, because I started out on social media attempting to be more polarizing than I think was probably valuable or useful. And that sort of had its time and its place. But now it's kind of like, all right, I'm building a brand. I want to be known as someone who is respectable and not someone who is searching for likes and clicks and those kinds of things. So information just being information, I think, is the name of the game for me at this point.
Yeah. So you did a post, I think it was today, I think I saw it, from the macros and micros of exercise. So going into that sort of first principles thing, like what are the most important pillars when a lot of my listeners are going to be mainly coaches, but there'll be some Gen Pop too. What are the main things that people need to consider first before getting into the weeds?
Yeah. So I would say number one is I think we can actually start with what we call an exercise and work backwards from there. So if I'm doing we'll just call it a pull down. Okay. We don't have to get, we don't have to talk about the trunk rotation and the pull down and, the degree of adduction and elevation, whatever. If I'm doing a pull down, right? What if you were to take like 3,000 steps backward and look at a pull down, and you were some sort of, this is how I like to sort of teach it as well, is if you were like an alien and you were looking at this thing and you had never seen someone do this thing, you'd be like, what the hell is going on? It looks like this person is doing this weird activity, right? And I think stripping something down to its sort of essential component parts is really what first principles are all about. So when you see an exercise, what you should see is, okay, there are these bones and these like tissues sort of moving, and they're moving sort of in the direction that's opposite this cable or this implement, whatever we're talking about. And so you can kind of break the first principle stuff into two major categories. You can break it down into, okay, what are the basic anatomy? What are the basic component parts of anatomy that I can learn about? So, first principles of bone structure and how, the knee is different from the elbow, even though both are technically hinge joints, contact surface relationships, right? There's the nitty gritty of like, what are the shapes of these things and how do they move? And then as a sort of secondary layer to that, like, what is a muscle and what does a muscle do? Right, so you have bones and you have muscles, right? And bones connect through joints, and muscles move joints. And then, on the other side, you kind of have like the basic physics, right? So I view physics as just our interaction with the physical world, right? Like force is, Tom talks about force as the agent of change. Force is just physical influence. And so first principles of physics would be, sort of leading in the direction of talking about things like, okay, well, if I'm doing an exercise, I have to touch something to be able to act on it and for it to be able to act on me. So we have things like point of application of a resistance. We have things like direction of resistance and how that changes throughout a range of motion. And so all those sorts of things are related to this concept of torque. And, what does torque break down to? Torque breaks down into moment, arm, and force. And what is a force? And what is a moment, right? So you just sort of dive deeper and deeper and you get to the very fundamental layers. And of course, you could eventually get to a layer of questioning that is not helpful, right? And that is more muddying than it is sort of clearing, which I kind of like to call mental masturbation, which we were sort of alluding to earlier. But I think that for the most part, if you can just kind of get to a point where you don't ask those super esoteric questions, well, like, you could get to a point where you could say, okay, like a moment arm is a perpendicular distance between a line of force and a point of application, right? Or rather a joint axis. And, as a consequence of that, you could start to ask like, well, what makes like a moment arm longer, like, and what makes it shorter? And then you could ask, well, why is a longer moment arm? Why does that create more resistance against us in a particular case? Well, because there's more surface area, or because the components of this are pulling at it in this and this way. And so that's when you start to, I think, get into the nitty gritty of like the 0.1% of what might be actually useful, but just knowing the basic definition of a moment arm being essentially the shortest distance between a line of force and a joint axis. I think that's what's good for most people most of the time in terms of its actual use. So those are kind of what first principles are. And those are kind of what I look at as like the macronutrients. It's just bones, muscles. What are the basic components of those two things? And then how do basic physics, i.e. torque, moment arm, et cetera, how do those things sort of interact with bones and muscles?
So what is a coach like? Because the biggest thing I find when coaches start to study this stuff is that they'll learn what a moment arm is and they could explain it. They could write it on a whiteboard, and then they get in the gym and they have no idea what they're looking at when their client is moving or when themselves are moving or when setting up an exercise. Like, what are some ways that coaches can actually start taking some of that stuff, and what are they looking for in the gym?
Yeah. So, I mean, translating that definition of like, because it's hard to do sometimes through audio. And I assume that most people listen to podcasts through audio. When I say that like a moment arm is the shortest distance between a line of force and a joint axis, what we're really talking about is how far is this force acting away from a joint? So if everyone can kind of picture the example I always use is like a dumbbell lateral raise. Everyone knows that like a dumbbell lateral raise, it's really hard, kind of when you get your arm out to 90 degrees, like at the top. And it's pretty easy when you get to the bottom, right? You could kind of just hold, if you're doing lateral raises with 20s and you're doing it in a controlled way. Most people who are, doing controlled lateral raises with 20-pound dumbbells, or I don't know what the kilogram equivalent is, 10, 8, whatever, something like that.
10 kilos.
Okay, yeah, close enough. Everyone kind of knows like, hey, it's, it doesn't feel so heavy at the bottom and it feels heavier at the top. And that's like a very experiential thing, right? So physics is very experiential. And when you try to analyze physics in the gym, bringing out your tape measure and measuring distances in their relative lengths, you start to kind of miss the forest because, again, physics is this thing that you should be able to sort of feel, not just this thing that you have in your head as a bunch of words. So, I advise a very similar concept when people are learning anatomy. The best way to learn is to sort of reinforce. It's not to just try to recollect, right? It's not just to try to repeatedly read things. And so when people are learning anatomy, I'll literally say, like, dude, download Complete Anatomy, download the app, shout out Complete Anatomy. And when you go into the gym, look at the muscles on the app that you're training. Look at their actions, look at the fiber directions. Yeah, it's not going to be perfect. Like anatomy apps are not perfect, right? But you can get a lot out of that because you're actually looking at, okay, what are the sort of component parts of this thing and how does it move these bones and how can I, appropriately load that action to be able to actually train it? So much in the same way, I think that all it really requires is just this constant sort of simplification back to, okay, what does this mean in the weight room, right? Because if all you have is perpendicular distance or shortest distance between line of force and axis, then you don't actually have a clear experience of what that means. So when you go into the gym and you do a dumbbell lateral raise, rather than trying to in your head again bring out your tape measure, just ask yourself and feel, okay, where does this thing feel heavier? Where is there more resistance in this exercise? And how can that actually influence a client? Well, if a client doesn't have any expectation about where this is going to be heavy, where this is going to be light, their experience is going to be very sort of weird. It's going to be like this thing that they're not prepared for, right? But if you tell a client like, look, hey, and I think a dumbbell lateral raise is a perfect example in many ways, but I see lateral raises or just longer lever motions like butchered with clients more than any other, for arcing reasons and distance reasons, and so a dumbbell lateral raise is something that's easily butchered. But I think that a lot of clients actually have a much greater ability than we perceive that they might with these things. If we were only able to sort of lay a groundwork of expectation, like, hey, this is going to be it's not going to feel like it's very hard at the bottom. But once you get to the top, it's going to be really hard and you're going to want to do weird things, right? But I'm going to ask you kindly not to do weird things, right? So that's like, a great way to sort of lay out the theory directly into application to actually create an expectation and as a consequence to create a sort of predictable experience for someone. Because a lot of people, at least in my experience in the general population who are being trained, they don't really know what they're feeling. They don't really know why they're feeling certain things, and so I think using words like, hey, it's going to be harder here, and it's going to be easier here, even with yourself, is a useful way to sort of translate that into practice. So I don't quite know if that was addressing what you were wanting me to address, but I think that's maybe a good starting point for that.
Yeah, I think that was good. I always talk about it to the students that come through our mentorship. It's like when you're looking at learning, everyone does what I call deep study. So they just go, right, go in, and just hope that this anatomy sticks. And I'm like, well, that's part of it. Like you have nothing to practice and play and reinforce if you don't look at like origin assertion of the rec fem, for example. But from that, I always go, and what's an active study? Well, could you watch a video on, let's shout out, Ben Yanes' Instagram channel, going through split squat variations and talk about the rec fem and go, oh, I can see how he's put that in the gym. And then can you go and play? Can you get on the gym floor and like feel that and work it? And then could you get a reinforcement on that? Speak to our mentor, get on a Q&A, ask questions. And I think that's where things kind of get complete. And I think when it comes to sort of like moment army stuff, the way I always like look at it is like, well, line of force with free weights is always straight down. So how far is the weight away from the shoulder? And then with cables, and the machines get a little bit trickier, but with cables, it's generally the line of the cable. So when does the cable get closer to the joint you're moving? And then just play around with that. If I increase this cable up a little bit on a hip abduction, oh, that cable now gets closer to my hip. Now that feels a little bit lighter. And that's when you start putting these pieces together, right?
Yeah. And I also think that, there are layers to that too, where, sort of combining the experience of what that greater distance feels like with your awareness of, the theoretical concepts, like that's kind of where the magic happens to me, because you can kind of start to I guess see more of an alignment between theory and application when you're able to sort of simultaneously juggle what you feel like you do know with what you're kind of being creative about. And I think being creative, as you mentioned, is a very important thing, because a lot of people at first, I think it's a requirement that when you're learning a topic at first, you kind of just have to adhere to whatever you're being told, right? Like you don't have the tools to be able to really jump outside a particular boundary. But once you get to a point where you feel like you have a good base of knowledge, taking that step, taking that leap between just doing whatever you've been told or just thinking whatever other people have told you and actually being able to sort of step outside of that, that's a very unique experience that I think a lot of people don't actually have, because it's a very scary step to take in some ways. It maybe scary is a strong word, right? But let's say, for example, if you consumed all of Tom's, online course content, just hours and hours and hours and hours, you will be very, very biased to just believe whatever he says. And, for very good reason. A very experienced guy, the theory is there, application is there, but there comes a certain point where you start to have to be willing to think for yourself. And you, I think, only really sort of are able to develop your own sort of model and your own approach to things, specifically with yourself, but also with clients, when you're able to sort of step outside of that box and be willing to get a little creative in a way that, may lead you to be wrong about something or may lead you to fail at something. And I think that, it's very cliched at this point, but like, we do really only learn from things that we get wrong at first. And so I think that is maybe the biggest difference that I've seen in myself, is like, I actually am actively looking for things now to be wrong about, or I'm looking for things to, be disproven about in terms of my intuition about a particular exercise. So I'm much more careful now with just saying that this is this way and this is how it should be. And I definitely got that from Tom specifically in Oklahoma, is like everything was a question and everything was an investigation and everything was like hey, let's see how it goes, rather than this is how it will be. So I think just that framework is one that will really play into this synthesis between theory and application.
It takes the pressure off you as a coach as well, right? I've been having recently a number of personal training sessions with Michael Goulden, who runs the RTS courses here in London. And it's almost infuriating how you never really get answers from him. It's like, and why do you think this is? I don't know. We'll see. And it's the everything is experiment mentality that I think Tom's got as well, where you're just like, but if you take that pressure off you as a coach, like, okay, let's explore stuff. How do I learn what to test? Have a play around. Did it work? No? Cool. Move on. I've now found information that didn't work. That's good. Now I can funnel and filter my decision-making process down. Like, do you think that while it's good to be able to get out and think for yourself, is there a sort of a rite of passage, or there's a time and a place in a coach's journey where it's important to just be sort of like, right, pick a mentor and just get really good at one system before trying to have your own little stamp on anything?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think I went through that phase. And to be honest, the reason I'm making a point about it is because I think that I was in that phase for too long. Like for too long of a time, I was in this position where I felt like I was relying on the next mentor to be able to validate my own opinions and validate my own. It was like I was needing someone else's approval for being able to think a new thing or to be able to disagree. And I guess that really started for me like freshman year, of high school, right? So like just when I started to buy like a random anatomy textbook, I asked my mom to buy it for me because I didn't really have too much cash at the time, and she complied, and at the time it was like the textbook knows all, and so, but that makes sense, and so I absolutely think that you need to be able to sort of dive down these different rabbit holes deep enough to see that there's no single rabbit hole that will give you all the answers. And I think that you only get to the point where you can be creative once you've gone far enough to run into a roadblock with a particular system, right? So there may be a point where, and I'll give maybe a concrete example. Like the reason I moved on from the PRI stuff was because I started to run into problems with clients that I just couldn't resolve with that model. And, for a while it was like, it's me, I'm not applying this correctly, blah, blah, blah. And then you jump to the next thing and it's like, oh, this system had a solution that the other one didn't have. Let me see how deep I can go into this one. And then eventually you run into the roadblock and you just bounce to the next thing, right? And you come out of it with all these different nuanced experiences and details. And hopefully you come out of it too with a more principle-based approach, which says, hey, for this particular scenario, this thing may be more appropriate. Not necessarily like, hey, this system is always right and this system is always wrong, but what are the bits and pieces that I can take from either that may give me a little bit more of a holistic sort of model as opposed to just this black and white sort of thinking.
So having gone through this journey from powerlifter to PRI to almost sort of mechanics and the bodybuilding side of things, putting aside powerlifting where they're absolutely necessary because they're part of the sport, what place do you now think the big three have in the average gym goer's hypertrophy toolbox?
I think they're a great selection for people who enjoy them. And that's about as nuanced as my opinion at this point will get. I think that generally speaking, that the big three barbell lifts, and I was actually just writing like a blog post for the newsletter on this. One of the biggest mistakes that I made for the longest time was thinking that I had to do specific things and thinking that I had to do specific movements to be able to make progress, right? Because that's kind of the story that we're told, and that's what we're indoctrinated into thinking is I need to do bench, squat, and deadlift if I want to be big and strong like Arnold, right? Because that's Arnold did that and Ron did that, and so you get sort of trapped into that belief system, and it's almost like this scary thing to be able to actually not do it. I remember the transition that I made from when I had been squatting and benching and deadlifting regularly for years and years to just like, hey, instead of doing barbell squats this week, I'm going to do hack squats, and I'm not even going to squat under a barbell. Like that was like a scary thing because I was like, oh my God, are my results going to, and lo and behold, that's not the case. And so you start digging for reasons like, oh, why did I start to actually make improvements as a consequence of not doing those things? Well, maybe it has something to do with the fact that like these are motions that you and your body have to work around and that don't necessarily work around you, right? These are selections that are basically based off of a sport which has specific requirements. It's kind of like saying, if you want to build glutes, like you have to go and sprint because all the sprinters, have big glutes, right? Which, hopefully people realize is not the case. So, overall, just to take a step back from that specific tangent, I think that, people get tied to things and do them for a long time and maybe do them longer than they should and maybe even into injury because of this emotional attachment of, they've been told, but also simply because it's something that is motivating and that, they can drive progress on and see progress on very clearly. Like, hey, this week I'm adding this plate to this thing and I've never done this before. Right? Like, that is a huge part of what creates adherence in a client or in a program. So if a client comes to me or if a trainer comes to me and they're like, hey, look, I really like to barbell bench press and their shoulders don't particularly agree with that, you just have to have the discussion of like, hey, this is something that we can absolutely do, but you just have to understand what the trade-offs of this thing are. So the way I like to sort of frame it to people is I like to think about exercise, and this is a very sort of RTS mentality, is like exercise is just motion of the body with resistance added on top. It's not this thing that exists with resistance first that you then sort of slide into and sort of accommodate around. And so my general mentality now with people who are not attached to specific things is, let's see how you move. Let's see where you're comfortable with whatever range you feel like you can own and control. And then let's add a resistance that makes sense based on that motion. And the whole barbell squat bench deadlift thing is actually the opposite of that. It's, hey, let's have these cookie cutter movements, and let's just sort of throw you into them and expect you to be able to work around the constraints that they provide. And so that's something that I think really dug me down that pain hole for a very long time, that I sort of had to learn the hard way. So I get very passionate about that kind of stuff when it comes to clients talking about that, because I know people who have literally had shoulder pain for like 10 years, and then we do a cable press and it's like magically their shoulder is healed. And they think it's some sort of voodoo magic. But generally speaking, I would say that I tend not to include them in a program unless I am specifically asked to include them in a program.
I very much agree with everything you said there. I've come on a real journey with the big three, because I went from that point where, like yourself, like all of us, when we start training, we're told these are the things you need to do, and I did them religiously, and then I started learning from the exercise mechanics, and this is the third, fourth hand exercise mechanics, where it's more about the principles rather than who are you and what do you have and what do you own and what are your goals. And it was like, you have long femurs, you're not built to squat. And if my goal in life, my only singular goal, I didn't want a business, a wife, a family, I didn't want anything else. I didn't want to go out for brunch with my friends on a Saturday. I just wanted big quads. Then that's a very, very sound piece of advice. But as I kind of went through, and I no one taught me, like, well, how do we find your squat? How do we kind of like allow you to improve movement? I went so far down the machine and sort of high intensity bodybuilding sort of route that when my squat got worse, because a lot of my mobility issues that I thought I had were skill issues, because I just regressed in this pattern to that point where it's now like, would I force anyone to squat, bench, and deadlift? Absolutely not. Do I think they're the best exercise for hypertrophy in anything? Normally not. But the ability sometimes for a lot of people to do some form of squatting in a different stance or a different, barbell or whatever you're using, I think it does a few things. I think as you start getting out of your 20s and into your 30s, and you get to that point where you're like, well, I don't really care about being the biggest dude in the room anymore. Like, I've got other priorities in life. And these big three lifts are often the skills that I can then take into the next phase of my training career. I want to get good at a lift. And that skill component is very different on a more externally stable hack squat where, well, it's kind of taken care of. So I think they have their place. But again, it really depends on that client and what they want and how that changes over their training life.
Yeah, and I think that it's funny you mentioned not being the biggest and strongest as the priority, because that was always the case for me, as I'm sure it is many guys that get into training from sport. And only in the last, like, I want to say year or so have I just made the priority like having fun. Which, whenever someone used to say that to me, I'd be like, dude, like, you're soft, like, come on, you don't train hard. And so now it's kind of just like, I look forward to training because, I have a very broad framework for what I do. It's not like I don't have a general plan, like I sort of know what I'm going to be training on a particular day. But within the context of that day, I actually allow myself to kind of just play around. So today I'll do this pull down variation. Next week I'll do a variation. Maybe I'm in a different gym and I'll get super creative. And what it's allowed, and this is kind of a similar theme to our conversation earlier about sort of allowing yourself to be a little bit more free and a little bit more creative, is structure is great until it's not. Like, structure is great until it actually becomes a limiting factor. And a good example of this might actually be, my training partner, who has been training for 15, 20 years now. I mean, he's an IFBB pro. He got his pro card in 21. He's competing in the New York Pro next April. As advanced a trainee as one can be, he has recently taken to a much more free flowing approach, which is not to say that there isn't a schedule. There is a schedule, but just more so, he sort of goes into every day not with the expectation that he has to do a particular number of sets. He pays attention to what he's feeling a little bit more, because he's had issues with injury, as pretty much anyone does at that level of advancement. And what he was finding was that the structure that he was sort of forcing himself to adhere to was actually digging him deeper into fatigue holes than he would have liked. And so he, as someone who was very, very successful for a very long time with that structure, had to be able to sort of pull away from that to be able to actually continue to progress. So that's kind of like an interesting theme that you see across time and across advancement in different domains, where the structure is really, really useful until it actually starts to hold you back and prevent you from sort of pushing yourself to the next level. And I think that goes for education as well, as we discussed. But for me in my own training, that's something that has made it immensely more enjoyable as of late, specifically just because I've allowed myself to do what I want on a given day, again, underneath of the umbrella of a framework, but not necessarily something that I am getting to the point where I'm feeling stressed about it, like I need to be doing it.
Yeah.
So I think it's just all about time and place. Beginner trainees, they need structure. They need to be able to see something on a piece of paper and check the box. But I think once you've sort of gotten to a point where that's almost restrictive in a way that isn't helpful, I think, you need to be able to sort of pivot from there and step into realms that are sort of unknown to you to be able to continue to advance. Because it's like, how could it be otherwise? Like, how could you continue to progress in something doing what you've always done?
And going back to that conversation at the start about nuance, right? The structure as a tool, in the same way that people go, MyFitnessPal is causing you to have bad relationship with food. Well, MyFitnessPal is a tool. Like, a true healthy relationship with food is, I can go and track my food without getting obsessive, and I could not track without getting fearful. In the same way that what is the goal? Everyone's going to have different priorities in life as we go through different periods. Like, if I wanted to step on a bodybuilding stage in 6 months, you better believe I'm going to start adding some structure in my routine, because I want to have an element of control to get the desired outcome. Whereas and I'll throw a shout out to Cass here in this example, right? I don't think Cass has trained for a structure in decades. And that's not a knock, because what is Cass's goal? He wants to go into his gym. He wants to play around with stuff. He wants to explore what he's learning to push his business forward in terms of education. So Cass's training goal is an educational outcome, which then doesn't lend itself to structure. But if you wanted to join a powerlifting competition, then periodizing and intensification, accumulation phases, and sort of rep schemes and loading patterns, these things become much more relevant tools.
Yeah. And I think that in and of itself, the desire for structure is something that is tricky to break down, because I think oftentimes people desire structure in very specific areas when they don't feel structure in other areas. If that makes sense. And I think that's why a lot of people get, they're described as like gym addiction. It's like the gym addiction is one that is simply just providing a sort of bedrock for your day, right? It's something that is reliable. But when that thing starts to become stressful in a way that is unproductive, and I found this personally, like it does start to affect the rest of your life. I'm sure you've gone through time periods where it's like, oh my God, I didn't hit my lift on this day. My day is ruined, or I am a piece of shit, or I am not, good enough. And so I think when it starts to get to that point, like, yeah, that drives progress, that drives adherence, but it will only probably do so for so long. And there are probably people listening who are still in that phase and they're like, what the fuck is this guy talking about? And I just think, like, time is the ultimate teacher in that regard. I think everyone sort of runs into that roadblock eventually, and if they don't, they're probably at the highest level, so congrats.
So delving into some of the specific stuff that people can take away, we said we were going to try and make this as much of an actionable episode as possible. And when people talk about exercise mechanics these days, they talk femurs, they talk ankles, they talk tib fibs, but then everything kind of gets forgotten from the pelvis up. So if someone's looking to grow a big upper body, what are some of the mechanical considerations or the structural considerations that people need to think about when starting to put together the best exercises for them?
Well, that's a big question. It's a risky question because I can take it in 20 directions,
Take it whichever direction you think is most appropriate.
All right. So, I mean, if we're thinking upper body, for now we'll exclude trunk. All right. We'll exclude abs, which abs is something that I have recently been frustrated about, because people are still on this bandwagon of, like, if you train abs, like, your waist is going to get blocky. My theory on that is just that people are lazy and they don't want to train abs. Anyway, in terms of upper body stuff, we have shoulder and elbow, right? We can get into the nuances of the specific joints in the shoulder, and there are a number, and the specific joints in the wrist and the fingers. But, like, for now, I think we can just sort of categorize upper body exercise into shoulder and elbow and sort of a combination therein. And the thing that's important to understand about the shoulder is that you have so many options, right? There's so many movement options, and sort of back to first principles. The reason you have so many movement options is because you have so many different muscles that cross the shoulder, and you have so many different fiber directions that articulate with the joint surfaces of the upper arm bone and all of the different parts of the scapula and the clavicle. And what that really, in essence, is because of the relationships between the bones, right? The fact that these bones are very, very mobile relative to the hips and the knees. And so when it comes to talking about femurs and shins and ankles and stuff, lower body training to me is not too complex. Like, it's fairly straightforward. You only have so many options that you can practically utilize. But when it comes to the upper body, it's like, every single degree of abduction you can do a press in is one that may train the upper body slightly differently. And so it can kind of get overwhelming because you have so many different options to choose from. And so where I like to kind of break things down is, I think, in a general structure of like, okay, I have these different categories of push and of pull, and then I have different planes or different directions that I can load, push, or pull. And then as sort of a sidebar there, you also have raising options, which you could technically call a lateral raise a push if you wanted to call it that. Like, who cares? But when it comes to dividing out pushes and pulls, I like to categorize things basically, from the mid to lower pecs down, and then from the mid to upper pecs and sort of out, right? So you have your presses that are going to be sort of more upper pec, front delt dominant. You have your presses that are going to be sort of middle pec, lower pec dominant. And then you sort of have everything in between. And obviously there's overlap between all of those things. But when it comes to pressing, like, mostly horizontal pressing is going to be the thing that I think from a front standpoint is going to be the thing that, develops your tissues.
I want to just clarify on that one. You said mostly horizontal pressing. Now, I saw a video of you recently saying you were not a big fan of flat pressing, and it's normally sort of like the 15 to 45 range upwards.
Yeah.
Why is that?
So if we think about loading the shoulder in a direction which would, we'll say, most advantage, middle to lower pecs, right? It's kind of a direction that would be, if you follow the arc of the shoulder, and for anyone who's kind of watching, you can sort of picture this. The arc of the shoulder moves like this, right? It moves in an arc. And the sort of more back behind your body or arm moves, the more upward it kind of has to scoop, right? In a natural sort of retraction, elevation type direction. And the middle and the lower pecs are fantastic movers of the shoulder girdle in creating protraction, which in fancy terms is basically just saying, like, if your shoulder girdle is going to fall off your body backwards, like, your mid and lower pecs from a certain angle are fantastic at making sure that doesn't happen. And so from the perspective of a flat angle press, right, that's a fairly decent angle to load those tissues at, right? Most people, when they lay down on a flat press, are not going to be like rounded over with their shoulders up off the pad. They're going to be maybe a little bit extended in their spine. Their chest is maybe going to be naturally pulled up a little bit. And even if it's not, it's pretty easy to get someone just to, assume a natural degree of arch. The problem, however, with the flat angle for a lot of people is that the degree of shoulder rotation, specifically into internal rotation from that position, is one that is usually approximating an end range position, right? So if everyone kind of like gets down on a flat bench and they sort of just pull their arm back to where, maybe they can sort of envision getting to the bottom of a press in, and they sort of just fix their upper arm and move their hand forward and backward, what they'll often find is that they have a lot of motion backward. In other words, the hand can really fall far, sort of back behind the head, but they don't really have a lot of end range forward, right, into internal rotation. And what I kind of view rotation as representing is, what are the muscular abilities of the shoulder and what are the soft tissue abilities of the shoulder in a particular position? So if you get to a point where you have, let's say, X degrees of, let's say 100 degrees of total rotation, right, in a particular position, and you are 5 degrees away from one of those endpoints, that by definition is close to a structural and a functional end range, meaning that it may be difficult for you to actually, and I'll use this broad term, stabilize from a contraction standpoint, that position. So again, what we see as a consequence of doing end range presses and pulls is oftentimes this desire to sort of move away from that end range. Or if we are stuck in that position and we're using a lot of load, we usually see a lot of sort of what I like to call like hidden motions or hidden forces, where, you know, like for example, if you get into a machine, it's oftentimes very difficult to look at bone motion and sort of bone compensation motion, because it's like the path of the machine is fixed. You don't really have to organize as specifically around the path of the machine. You can kind of push in weird directions. But when it comes to a flat press, and specifically like this 0 degree angle or even a slight decline, when people stick themselves in a significant degree of internal rotation, not only are they sort of not able to actually extend very far, like if you just took this to the extreme and you internally rotate your arm and you try to pull it back, it's usually not a very comfortable thing for a lot of people. And then when you add dumbbells on top of that and you start to load that sternoclavicular motion that I talked about, the middle and lower pecs really contributing to, on top of that, you add all kinds of forces that become, or that really make that motion particularly difficult to stabilize, right? So unlike in a cable press where you can play around with the degree of rotation and the angle that you're actually loading, and unlike in a cable press where you're able to actually freely elevate and retract your shoulder blade, you are stuck to a bench, which actually prevents that motion from significantly happening, right? You are specifically placing the part of your upper back which would allow motion to happen in a way that is compressing the actual joint surfaces, right? So you have this sort of pressure on the backside of the we'll call it the mid back, that to me oftentimes restricts motion. And you're doing it in a situation where you're loading an end range position of rotation. So if you're loading an end range position of rotation, I know this is kind of getting like weedy, but if you're loading an end range position of rotation, you'd better have motion somewhere else to kind of make up for that position. So when people do that same joint angle on a cable and they actually have the ability to really shrug up into that sort of elevated retracted position, a lot of times you don't see the same effects. And I've literally done like a one-to-one of myself of like, how does this flat press feel at this same theoretical loading angle compared to this cable press? And having the ability to actually move the shoulder much more freely makes a significant difference in how loading that position feels. So if I had to Cliff Notes summarize what I just said, if I lost anyone along that sort of train of thought, it's a flat press generally loads a very end range position of people's internal rotation. Not everyone, but certainly a significant portion of the population, especially when we use wider arm pass. And as a consequence of that, that joint position becomes more difficult to stabilize. That doesn't mean that we can't stabilize it, but it does mean that we're moving toward a sort of end extreme position. If you are in an end range position, and if you are loading that end range position in a plane that is not rotation, right? So if I'm doing like a resistance band rotation, right, that's fine. But if I'm sort of loading my arm backward as I'm in this end range position, I'd better have some degree of freedom of motion at my shoulder to sort of allow for that whole unit to actually move backward, as opposed to having to rely mostly on the glenohumeral motion to be able to accomplish that from a motion standpoint. So does that broadly make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. And then like, so going into that point about the bench, and then you're looking at the bench of like restricting range of motion at the shoulder blade, like,
yeah,
and comparing that to something like the cable press. Now, because this goes into the argument of should we lock our shoulder blades back and down, or should we allow them to move freely? Now, does this depend? Let's say we have someone who either they have a really good range of internal rotation and they can get into that position, or you found their active range and you're working within that. Is there an argument for sometimes using, let's say, a wider bench and locking our shoulders back and down to be able to create more stability at that movement, to be able to exert more force, as opposed to the cable press, which might be a little bit harder because it's a little bit more free motion? Is there a time and a place for that? As long as, I suppose, we're not locking the shoulder blades in for every exercise on every workout and everything is moving in this short range of motion.
Yeah, so I tend to lean in the direction of coaching shoulder blade motion where I see something that I don't like to see, as opposed to coaching shoulder blade motion sort of more unnaturally or upon my own volition. So if someone is doing an exercise and it looks to me to be mostly correct just from an intuitive standpoint and based on what I know, like what I expect to see, I tend not to coach shoulder blade motion. But specifically with pressing, I do find that, and specifically with flat pressing because of the angle that you're at, and the fact that if you are arching, like there is a very direct sort of compression of those tissues. I do find that most people need to cue some sort of retraction as they lower, right? And so the question is like, well, why do a lot of people need to cue retraction? Well, number one, it's not like like a normal flat dumbbell press, or really any kind of dumbbell press, it's not like a natural thing. Like lifting weights is not a particularly natural feeling. It's not like walking. You don't just sort of do it unconsciously. And if you start to try to walk consciously, it's very, very weird thing to do. But these are things that we consciously are loading at high magnitudes relative to normal life. These are things that we are loading very intentionally and specifically in one single direction. And so when it comes to pressing, and when it comes to that physical compression of the bench, I do like to cue a retraction. But what I tell people out of that is let things sort of be free out of that. Because what I usually find with over restricting scapular motion into that retracted position is that people either tend to start to overthink the motion, which is the biggest thing to me. Like, forget about pain, discomfort. People tend to start to overthink, especially people who don't even know that they have scapulas or scapulae. They tend to overthink and sort of mentally masturbate the motion and do a bunch of squeezing stuff. And so rather than coaching the scapula, I prefer to coach the upper arm on the press, and I prefer to coach the scapula on the descent. So for me, it's like as weights are lowering, to put it in like maybe simpler terms, I like to tell people to sort of squeeze up and back with the shoulder blades. And then as people are pressing, I like to tell people to angle their elbows inward toward their chest. Right. And so that's a great way to sort of coach the distal end of the humerus rather than to try to micromanage motion of the scapula, because I think that our best attempt at micromanaging motion, like scapular motion, is very complex. Like the scapula can never move in a single plane at once. Right. As soon as it starts to move in any direction, it's also moving in a sort of a degree of rotation, or, whether it be upward or downward, or sort of internal and external. Right. So just the complexity of moving that is so much greater than I think we're able to consciously orchestrate outside of just general, hey, let me move these things up and back. On the press, your pecs, for those of you who are maybe not super familiar with shoulder mechanics stuff, your pecs literally will pull your whole shoulder girdle forward. So if you are actively attempting, at least your middle and lower pecs, if you are actively attempting to move your shoulder blades backward as your pec is pulling your arm forward, that is a recipe for either using no load and just, again, mentally masturbating your way through the motion, or, in my own experience, injury and pain, right? That's the classic thing with powerlifting. And of course, there are other variables involved in that: load management, intensity management, blah, 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 right? But for the most part, I tend to find that that's a very successful strategy in working around the constraint of the bench, because again, the bench is something that you're saying will add a degree of anchoring and stability and allow you to create higher outputs. But the trade-off, as with every other thing that has a trade-off, is that you have potentially a lower ability to move. So I think that trade-off can kind of be worked around to some degree if we're able to consciously retract and then allow things to protract, because I tend to think that people have a greater problem, again, pulling their shoulder blades together, especially because the load is getting heavier as they're lowering the weights, as compared to the press, where the press is just more like, hey, just fucking get these things off your chest. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of my stance on that, is shoulder blades on the way down, arms on the way up, but I tend not to restrict the motion for the kind of mechanical considerations that I mentioned.
And I think the big thing there is the nuance of the cue, right? Because what you're essentially saying there is that, like, I'm not stopping things moving forward, but I'm not over cueing this protraction because that's what the pecs do. Because while that could be a really good cue for the veteran bodybuilder of 10 years who got this efficiency that can move really quickly and can do every little micro movement, if you do that with a complete beginner, they're immediately collapsing the rib cage, losing the pec entirely, and it's unstable all over the place. So, like, that cue, I suppose, will then depend on what you use, depending on who you've got. A beginner may be a little bit more, yes, stable in the lifts where we're going to go super, super heavy, and then maybe we'll encourage some movement on some of the exercises in the B's and C's series just to make sure that shoulder stays healthy, whereas the advanced bodybuilder may do overall total less sets, but is more efficient. Now we're looking, okay, you've got more control of this. Let's just make sure this exercise is as good as it can be.
Yeah, and I think the key point there with, the protraction, retraction comment is your upper arm, depending on the arm path you use, will sort of naturally, as you move your arms backward and as you squeeze your shoulder blade, your upper arm will kind of move with your scapula, like upward and backward and sort of toward your spine if you bring the arc around far enough, right? But as you press, your scaps are actually coming downward and sort of outward. And that's downward and outward motion is very difficult to coordinate with the forward motion of your arm. So on the way back, it's like it's a lot more natural of a feeling motion. Like if you're just like doing a row, like a low to high row, it's a very natural feeling motion, like a scooping up into that retraction pocket. But the sort of inverse of that can be, again, complex because you're coaching different planes of motion at your shoulder at every second, and you're also coaching a different plane of motion at your humerus throughout the entire range. So just to also maybe make that point more concrete is I'm also not opposed to someone doing a flat press. It's just generally speaking, I find that for the goals that I'm trying to accomplish, usually a 15 degree tends to be just more practical for most people, or a 10 degree, if not about the mechanics reasons or because of the mechanics reasons, then simply just from a practical standpoint of like, if you've ever coached someone who is not the best at getting the dumbbells back, it's like, it's a lot less of a hassle, even just having a slight angle. And that's kind of where I think that the personal trainers will sort of see the point in that more practically as well, is just not having to, I've coached people who are like 86 years old who literally can't get back into that flat position and also get back up. So just
Yes,
a practical consideration there.
Yeah, I overall agree with you. I also think a point to add that as well is like when you're looking at complete beginners, working with gravity is going to be your best friend and working against gravity. So if you've got people that can't control the shoulder blades at all and they're coming into a position, it's elevation, it's all over the place, it's unstable, coming up into that 10 to 15 degrees, you're just working with gravity to just kind of sit you back, get a bit of lats involved without having to kind of cue 10, 12 different stuff for someone that doesn't know what these things actually mean.
Yeah. And I think just also to kind of, because I want to be with our goal of being practical here as well, I want to kind of mention that in terms of pressing overall, I also subscribe, to the opposite end of the extreme, which would be I don't really tend to coach vertical pressing either. Right. So in the same way that I wouldn't necessarily off the bat prescribe a 0 degree press, I also probably wouldn't prescribe a 90 degree press because most people who, find themselves at 90 degrees or even 60 degrees end up just extending their spine, so that the relative direction they're loading is more horizontal anyway. So I tend to, as a practical piece of advice for people, coach between, we'll say 10 and 45 maybe at the highest, for a lot of different reasons. Again, even if we didn't talk about the pain thing, even if we didn't talk about the mechanical considerations of the end range degrees of rotation, if we just purely think from a resistance profile standpoint and from a direction of loading standpoint, again, first principles, if I'm at a 45 degree incline, I can actually load my arm behind my body. If I'm at a 90 degree incline, I actually have no ability to load any degree of stretch position, right, where I'm the strongest, where theoretically we would get the most bang for our buck in terms of outcome and in terms of creating tension. So with pressing in general, and with thinking more broad scopes again, I tend to stay in the realm of that sort of zone of like, we'll say like, a decline. Again, I like to do decline stuff on cables. But from a dumbbell bench standpoint, from a free press standpoint, 10 to 45 degrees. And then, I get funky with angles on cables, but for pretty much all pec based goals, it's mostly just going to be your horizontal kind of press. And, to clarify that too, horizontal does not mean, parallel to the floor. Horizontal is in reference to the direction that you're loading your arm relative to your torso. And that is unlike muscles of what we'll call the back, right? Because even if you didn't look at any of the joint structure stuff, any of the rotation stuff, you have a significantly wider surface area of attachment of the back muscles. And as a consequence of that, you can load the back muscles in a much sort of wider range of motion. So unlike with pressing, where I may not actually do a direct overhead press, I do see some reason to do something that is resembling more of a pure vertical pull down because we have tissues that are oriented purely vertically, right, in the lats.
On that note then, so like, because one of the biggest struggles I think a lot of people have when trying to get into particularly length and range lat challenges is poor overhead range of motion. Mm-hmm. Now, we could go in two schools of thought, and I'm sure the answer is, I certainly believe the answer is somewhere in the middle here, that this could be down to we have poor overhead range of motion that we could look at working on and improving and fixing. And there's the other element where, well, this is what we've got, let's work with it. Where do you stand on sort of that spectrum? And if someone's struggling to get overhead range, is it more about getting them into a position to be able to find those length and range fibers? Or is there things that we can do maybe in our accessory work to try and encourage more range in future phases? And how would that look in a program for you?
So I think two directions I can take this. One is I'm with a client, what do I do? And second will be the more nuanced, like what in theory may work a little better. So the first thing is that with this, just to address this concept of limitation, I kind of like to take the word limitation or poor mobility. I kind of like to remove that from my vocabulary, because when you are dealing with a client, especially a new client, and you have expectations for what they're going to do and what they're going to look like, I think that only really hinders your ability to actually coach them for their individual structure, their motion. So I tend to remove those words I try to. It's tough to, because it's so, I think indoctrinated into this culture. But just getting rid of expectation of motion, I think is number one, is the most important thing. Because there are people who, and I mentioned to you, I was in St. Louis this weekend. Like, my brother is like as in shape as, a 26-year-old could be. And he just has this, like, the weirdest clavicular structure I've ever seen. It literally looks like he has this big, like, hump that was just built like in utero, where he just like cannot move his arm above like 120 degrees of flexion, pretty much in any plane. And so for a while I was like, what the hell is wrong with this kid? Like, what's going on? Until I noticed the bone structure, and I was like, oh my God, this, he's literally like bone on bone here, right? So that's the first thing to acknowledge, is that there's a lot of different reasons that someone may appear to, quote, lack something that you expect them to have. So that's kind of why, just a reason behind that. But in terms of practical application, if I'm with a client one-on-one and I'm not too concerned about that, I'm just going to sort of meet them where they're at. And I'm going to say, okay, if we can't get purely, vertical and purely overhead today and load that, super directly, let's just go slightly below that point. Let's load those tissues, right? We're still loading very similar tissues at a slightly lower angle. Let's improve the contraction of those tissues. And then let's see over time, like, is this something that opens up? If it's not something that opens up, I'm not hyper concerned about it, right? Especially if people don't have pain. I'm not going to try to fix something that isn't broken. But if it is this person's particular goal and they're coming to me specifically to address this thing that they want to address for some reason, then I'm going to sort of start to reverse engineer the process and work backward from there. So in a program, what this might look like is, okay, I want to get into this position. The first question becomes, what is the position of the bones in that position? The second question then becomes, what tissues take me into that position as a consequence of that bone position? Again, all back to first principles. So if I think about, an overhead position from pretty much any direction, the tissues that are going to take me there are the same. Of course, you can, do something that's more like inward to outward, like a wire haze. You could do something that's more like a snow angel, outward to inward, right? But in any case, it's like we're focused on basically traps, serratus, and delts, right? And so in a program, instead of starting with the activity of let me do a vertical pull down and see where I can take my arm to, I'm going to train the tissues that would take my arm to that position, right? My lats are not going to elevate and flex my shoulder to that position. They will eccentrically, right? But maybe that's part of the problem, is I'm loading these things eccentrically rather than concentrically first. So for example, a lot of people have trouble with like the katana overhead extension. They just feel uncomfortable in that position. A lot of times what I'll do is I'll program in some kind of cable raising motion up to that position prior to that motion. And a lot of times the range tends to feel better, and the discomfort in my experience tends to go away. Like, I know I had a client who, like, his entire training career, which is probably between 5 and 10 years now, he could just never do that exercise without discomfort. And I was doing it with him. And so I was like, okay, this load direction looks fine. The position looks fine. We're still running into issues. And then we did the Y raise and went back to it. And all of a sudden, no pain, no discomfort, et cetera. So, I tend to try to, instead of addressing, again, in this theoretical scenario where this person has the specific goal where they're keen on opening up this range for whatever reason, I will do it in a way where they're still actively sort of contracting themselves into that position, but just with another motion, so that I'm doing it concentrically first. I know that I can actively pull myself there, and then I tend to go into other motions to see, okay, how does this change the experience of this other motion? Because a lot of times what I do find is it tends to change it quite significantly. So if that makes
suppose
sense.
there you're spending so much time in that position, then you're finding a way of getting in there, then you're doing that other exercise that loads that position. We're now just slowly teaching the nervous system that this position's okay to be in.
Yeah. And, I think that can be a slow process. It might be a session. It might be 10 weeks, right? And depending on how old the person is, right? How long they've been training, how sort of ingrained in their habits and their patterns they are. All those things are considerations. But, I tend to start with the easiest, most obvious solution, which would be, let's just make sure that this is set up correctly first, because 80 to 90% of the time that is the issue. And sometimes all it takes is like, if loading my arm more sagittally doesn't feel good, let me come out into more of the scapular plane thing, and let me see how that feels instead. Let me see how actually changing the load direction according to that changes the experience. And a lot of times, again, just sort of playing around with those minor degrees can actually make a very, very big difference, even to the point where it could be a matter of actively telling someone to, pronate at the top of the motion and supinate as they come down, right? You have no idea what kinds of influences may be contributing to the thing that appears to be the problem, right? So if someone has a shoulder issue and they're forcing their forearm, I see a lot of people doing that pull down where they're forcing the supination and the adduction, and they're coming up really slowly, and they're really mentally masturbating it. It's just let your brain coordinate the motion. Let your brain sort of coordinate what it wants to do in that particular context, and then work around that first. Don't try to orchestrate this thing, and don't try to be the master. Don't try to play chess before you've even done the motion in a way that feels like it's you can actually create output. So obviously in rehab that gets a little bit more complicated, and you have to be a little bit more considerate and less meatheady about it. But for a vast majority of people who have been training for a while, the less thinking in general you can sort of be doing exercise to exercise, I think the better, at least long term.
I think that's an important clarification, right? While I think it's good to take things from, going full circle, PRI, rehab-y based stuff, and this certainly has a place in our toolbox, but we often see coaches go so far down that wormhole that they become glorified physios and less coaches. And could someone's range of motion through the shoulder be fixed by rib cage mechanics, pump handle to bucket handle? Could it be through thoracic rotation work? Absolutely. But the problem I sometimes have with breathing work is it's like pissing in the ocean trying to make it yellow. We do so many breaths a day. We're always going to do more bad breaths than good breaths. So while, yes, add that in and try and encourage it, but if you've got no sort of almost concentric, loaded strength, something that's going to have a bigger bang for your buck in that moment to complement that with, you're either going to be waiting a very long time or ever to make any real substantial change, at least in my experience.
Yeah, and the hokey pokey thing that, and I say hokey pokey lovingly because this used to be me, but the hokey pokey thing that the breathing crowd does is they'll take some, rotation measurement, they'll do the breathing activity, and then they'll come back to the measurement, and the measurement will be different, and people will be like, wow, oh my God. I mean, if you've never seen that before, you're like, holy shit, this breathing thing could just create this conformational change, right? And then you start to realize that you could do any one of 1,000 different things and get that same change. I could go in the bathroom, take a shit, text on my phone, and come back and measure that position. And it could be different as a consequence of me having taken a shit. Right. And so people use that sort of strategy to create this buy-in. And the unknowing observer, the unknowing potential client buys into it because, oh my God, look at this range of motion. So I think that's another good point to make more broadly is range of motion is something is not a fixed number, right? Range of mobility, range of joint excursion is not fixed. You and I have been sitting for an hour. Our degree of hip extension having been in this position for whatever length of time is not going to be the same as if I'm doing an exercise and I'm actively training hip extension, right? I'm going to stand up. I'm going to feel like, holy shit, my hips are tight. And then I'm going to walk for a few steps, and all of a sudden that range will open up, right? So range of motion is contextual, not only to the physical scenario that you're in, but also the time that you're in it, the magnitude of loading that you have when you're in that position. And that can change very rapidly. And so I think that, it's important not to be fooled by these specific modalities. And it's important to remember that your mobility and your range of motion in whatever scenario will always be scenario specific and time specific. And it will be something that will change not only on a daily basis, but on like an hourly basis, on a minute to minute basis. And that's something that your body does very intentionally. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? If you sit in a car for 8 hours and you wake up the next day and your hip flexors feel tight, it's like, there's a very particular reason for that. You don't need to stretch for 10 hours, to make up for that process. So I think that's an important thing to just realize, is that these things are not fixed numbers, much in the same way, that your sort of calorie expenditure is not a fixed thing, depending on how much muscle you have, depending on your age, depending on your sex, right? These things are all sort of context dependent. And so I think that's just a good point to remember. If you ever feel like, oh, I'm restricted, or, oh, I'm tight, it's like, there's always a reason, and it's always context dependent. And what it depends on is usually the physics of the time and the magnitude.
I think there's two important things to take away from that. The first thing is that my editor is not a fitness professional. And you know full well he's going to go through this, and the clip he's going to cut out is the story about you taking a shit, because it's going to be the thing that resonates with him. But the second thing, I think it's almost quite freeing in this. Like, I'm not saying don't learn all the potential muscular limitations, structural limitations, rib cage, pelvis, all this different stuff. It's all good things to be able to try stuff and have more tools in your toolbox. But it's almost going back to Tom Purvis saying everything's an experiment, going back to Michael Goulden doing the same thing with me. It's quite freeing when look, it could be muscular, it could be joint, it could be nervous system, it could be that you're stressed, it could be what you did yesterday, it could be the sleeping position, it could be the fact that you're digesting food. There's so many different values of what could be causing that joint to be limited. If we go, right, what have you got today? And we'll work with what you've got today. And in the background, our tools and our study and our nerd shit, we can try and say, well, if we try some of this stuff, maybe what today overall will start to get better and better on an average. But it's not I need to know the answer why this person can't move through hip extension. Well, just work with the hip extension you've got. Like, go with what you know right now and take the pressure off yourself as a coach. So to bring this show to a close, because I could chat mechanics with you all day, but I know you have other things to do in your day. I've got two closing questions. One is, I know you did a little bit of a response to Bumstead on Chris Williamson recently. And as I saw Chris Williamson on his live show recently, I thought I'd pose kind of the same question to you. I'm not going to go for 10 because I think that's excessive and be here for an hour. But if you had 5 exercises, if you were on a desert island, you can only do 5 exercises for the rest of your life, which is hard for someone, I'm sure, who knows all the nuance. What would they be and why?
So I've had this conversation with a couple people, and what I've ended up saying is I refuse to answer the question, but I won't do that here because I'm under pressure and I peer pressured to do it. But I just want to make it clear that if I had the choice, which I don't clearly, that I wouldn't answer this question, because it kind of defeats the broad framework or the sort of nuanced framework, I guess, that I have around this.
I'll tell my sniper to take the red dot off your head now.
Yeah. Okay, good. So I would say 5 total for the whole body.
Let's go 5, yeah. And we're assuming here, because we're not saying 10, we're going to be missing some stuff. But like, what are the first 5 that come to mind?
So one would be 45-degree leg press. We'll call it a Cybex leg press.
And why Cybex and why 45 degree?
So the Cybex leg press that I have, I mean, there are obviously a bunch of different Cybex leg presses, but the one that I'm thinking of is just the specific angle of the seat can be reclined to such a degree that is very, very comfortable. right? So a lot of people who get into a leg press and put their feet up on the platform are already in too much lumbar flexion to be moving their hip comfortably, at least in my experience. So basically, you don't have to call it Cybex, but you could call it any leg press that basically has, a back pad that could come up from 90 down to about, 20 or something like that. Atlantis has a really good leg press like that, that is able to fold back quite significantly. So any 45 leg press that can adjust. And the reason leg press over something like hack squat or something like pendulum squat is just because we have a lot more options insofar as what we can do with our feet to create, that constrained closed chain, either unilaterally or bilaterally or whatnot. So you have a lot of, leg press is basically like if you want quads, glutes, adductors, and the associated spinal stuff, go with that. I'm not gonna pick a back squat and be a silly goose. So leg press would be one, and I can't really count. Like I can't say, I could also do calves on the leg press. Like that would be a different exercise.
I'll let you off because I think that I've given you 5. I've given you a lot of things to restrict. All right. I'll take that. Right. Leg press in the hole and all the things you can do.
I mean, if you really want to get creative, you could sort of rig it up so you could also press against the leg press and pull against it from the other side. So that could be like one piece for all that shit.
We're now stretching a little bit here. I've seen someone trying to leg curl with a seated row, and I'm like, I still don't think it's a seated row.
Yeah. See, I just try to beat the question. Okay, so we'll call that leg press 1 and calf also 1. And then in terms of upper body pressing, I'll say pretty much like a horizontal cable converging press. Mm-hmm. Something that's comfortable degree of abduction. So that's 2. 3 would probably be some kind of middle end of the bell curve row / pull down. So something that's not a row, but not a pull down, something that's like, slightly above 90 coming down to about in line with the body.
Like the biggest range of motion you can get through the lats through one exercise.
Pretty much. And then also, the associated upper back tissues that are also contributing to that. It's basically like if you could pick one back motion that would be in between everything, it would be something that's like a pull down that's, pretty close to your body, but not super close, but that is also slightly high to low. That's the back thing. And that would be chest supported, obviously.
And I suppose with that as well, depending on how, again, it would take away the chest support, but you can obviously manipulate your torso then to say, I'm going to go from this point, or I'm going to come forward to this point, or I'm going to go into the lengthened position and lean forward. You can do a lot with that, like the leg press.
Yeah, exactly. So chest supported row, cable press, leg press. 2 more. So it's really just a game of trade-offs at this point. I'll probably say face away curl and overhead extension.
Okay.
Because I would pick biceps and triceps over hamstrings. Because you could argue like, all right, we can find a way, to get a lot of activity in the hamstrings via the leg press, but obviously they will not be the limiter in a leg press. But I don't think that someone's hamstrings would shrink if they were only forced to do 5 exercises and then they were stuck with a leg press. Like if you train a leg press often and hard and you did different variations of a leg press, I think the associated co-contraction stuff that would be happening in the hamstrings would be enough for them to at least not lose function.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So, and then, something bicep, something tricep. Like I just, you gotta go with something arms as opposed to like middle delt or something like that. So that is
that an element of partly because of you being a bloke and you like training arms, or is there an element of the biceps and triceps allow good shoulder function because you're getting overhead, you're getting behind the body. There's a good number of stuff you can do with that.
Yeah, I would say both.
I like all those choices, and sometimes I appreciate I put you into a corner with that, and I would be the same, and I'd be trying to find ways to break the question if it was asked to me. But I like doing these things because sometimes being able to strip back and going, right, if we had to work with a minimal amount of stuff, it's good because if you ever had a client who's like, I've got 20 minutes to train, and I want to program, and I'm not going to be consistent without it, which is similar to where my training history of the last few months has been when my priority have shifted. Stepping back to just going, like, what are the basics? One really hard top working set. And then as I get back into a routine, I'm like, well, let's add a lateral raise. Let's add a leg curl. Let's add a second set to all of these. And then you can start to build from that foundations, but you've learned to be more efficient from that sort of, constricting it.
Yeah, and I think one thing that I would maybe add there, if you really wanted to cover more of the total body, what you could potentially do is you could say, like instead of the pulling motion, because of the constraints of that, like you could opt for something like a chin up, right? Because a chin up would give you some degree of the the whole back, depending on how you did it, but it would also give you a good amount of elbow flexor, right? And then if, instead of the cable press, what you could do is some kind of like Smith machine, mid incline, right? So those are two options which would include associated elbow stuff. And if you chose those, what you would have is you'd have two more slots, right, to choose from. So if you chose those, you could maybe include something like a cable lateral, and then you could include something like a seated leg curl, right, to sort of address the missing pieces.
I see what you did there. You sneakily broke the question, but I'm quite happy with the answer. So the last question I always ask people is one I ask everybody, because I think we all get so locked in our into study and putting people on a pedestal. And you said this yourself, right? You look for other people's validation. And I think sometimes it's good to pull back. Chris Williamson, again, when the event was on the weekend, called it a yogurt lid moment, where his friend of his met someone he idolized, and he was at his house, and he said, do you mind if I have a yogurt? He goes, well, your house, you do it. Pulled out this yogurt, opened the wrapper, and then just licked the yogurt. And all of a sudden, the aura's broken. He's just a normal guy, like all of us. So for people who've been following your work for a while and think, oh my God, like Ben's super smart, what is one thing you have changed your mind on?
In regards to anything, or in regards to my niche?
If you've got a good answer for anything, feel free to give it. If it's a training one, feel free to give that.
One thing I've changed my mind on. Reading outside the domain of your subject is as important as reading inside of the domain of your subject.
So you used to think that wasn't the case, and now you do?
Yeah.
Why so?
I think that there are too many smart people in the world who have come to similar conclusions for different reasons for you not to read outside of your domain. And the reason, maybe a more specific way to say that would be, there are so many smart people in the world that are not in your domain that you can learn principles from, that you can apply to your domain. And I used to think that all that really mattered was, reading the textbook and looking at the joint structure and just looking at the X's and O's. And I think that part of what has allowed me over time to think at a more principle-based level is seeing principles and understanding principles in other topics and in other genres of education. And that doesn't mean that, you spend 80% of your time reading outside of your domain, right? But just when I have, leisure time and I'm doing something like reading, I choose to read books that have nothing to do directly with biomechanics or joint structure and function or those kinds of things. And I think that that is part of what allows you to be less rigid with how your education progresses. And it's also partly what allows you to continue to think outside of the boxes that you sort of fallen into as a consequence of your profession.
I love the answer. And I have to I followed you for a number of years, first on YouTube and now through Instagram. You can kind of see that in your content, where it's still very quick, informative, bite-sized content, but you tell a story now. Like there is a rear delt video of Bumstead, and you tell the story of something you've learned that could help someone else do that. And I think you probably wouldn't have that ability of storytelling in a 40-second clip without reading something that's not just, this is how rear delts train in the lengthened position.
Yeah, I appreciate that nuanced noticing. Yeah.
I appreciate that. So for people who want to go and listen to your 40-second storytelling on Instagram or YouTube, where can people find beignets?
Yeah, just on Instagram, exactly spelt like my name is in hopefully the title of this podcast. And then, everything's in the hashtag bio link, modernmeathead.com. I have a member site and all my education stuff is in there as well. So,
mate, well, I very much appreciate you taking the time. I've really, really enjoyed this. I could sort of do this for hours on end. So I appreciate taking the time. Thank you.
Yeah, me too, Simon. Love to do it again.